Marcus Rivera had always been the golden child. At 32, he sat in his corner office on the 42nd floor, watching the city sprawl beneath him like a chessboard. His MBA from Harvard hung proudly on the wall, next to certificates of achievement that had once made his parents beam with pride. Yet as he stared at his reflection in the window, he felt hollow. The morning meeting had gone exactly as expected. Marcus had presented his quarterly projections with the same enthusiasm he'd perfected over 8 years at Sterling and Associates. His colleagues nodded approvingly. His boss, Jonathan Sterling himself, had given him that familiar smile and pat on the shoulder. "Excellent work as always, Marcus. You really know how to deliver what we need." But something twisted in Marcus's stomach at those words. What we need. When had his entire identity become about meeting other people's expectations? The realization had been building for months, maybe years. It started with small things. The way he automatically agreed with clients even when their strategies seemed flawed. How he'd learned to read the room and adjust his opinions accordingly. The careful way he crafted emails to sound agreeable and non-threatening. He'd become a master at being what others wanted him to be. His phone buzzed with a text from his mother. "Dad and I are so proud of you, sweetheart. The Johnsons were asking about your promotion again. When do you think you'll make partner?" Marcus set the phone down without responding. Even his family's love felt conditional, tied to his achievements and status. He thought about his younger brother Diego, who dropped out of law school to become a carpenter. Their parents still spoke about Diego in hushed, disappointed tones, as if his happiness building custom furniture was somehow less valuable than Marcus's spreadsheets and PowerPoint presentations. The afternoon brought another reminder of his gilded cage. Sarah Chen, a junior analyst, knocked on his door with a proposal that made Marcus's pulse quicken. She'd identified an emerging market opportunity that could revolutionize their approach to sustainable investing. It was bold, risky, and absolutely brilliant. "What do you think, Marcus? Should we pitch this to Sterling?" Marcus felt the familiar weight of calculation settling over him. The proposal was exactly the kind of innovative thinking that could catapult both their careers. But it was also unproven, unconventional, and Sterling and Associates had built its reputation on steady, predictable returns. If the proposal failed, Marcus's carefully constructed image as the reliable team player would crumble. "It's interesting, Sarah," he heard himself saying, his voice taking on that measured, diplomatic tone he'd perfected. "But I think we need to consider the firm's risk tolerance. Maybe we could develop this further, run some additional models." He watched the light dim in Sarah's eyes as she nodded politely and gathered her papers. Marcus knew he'd just killed her enthusiasm in the name of protecting his own reputation. The same reputation that was slowly suffocating him. That evening, Marcus found himself in his usual booth at Henley's, the upscale bar where his colleagues gathered to decompress. The conversation flowed around him like white noise, filled with the familiar rhythms of corporate small talk. Someone was complaining about a difficult client. Another person was speculating about the upcoming restructuring. Marcus smiled and nodded at the appropriate moments, but his mind was elsewhere. He thought about a book he'd recently discovered, hidden away on his shelf since college. Niccolò Machiavelli's observations about power and influence had seemed purely academic then. But now, certain passages haunted him. The Italian philosopher had written about the trap of seeking others' approval, how it made rulers weak and dependent. "He who seeks to please everyone pleases no one," Machiavelli had observed. And he who tries to avoid all criticism becomes paralyzed by the fear of judgment. As Marcus sat surrounded by his colleagues, he realized he'd become exactly what Machiavelli had warned against. A leader who'd traded authentic influence for the comfortable illusion of approval. He'd spent so many years reading the room, adapting his personality, and avoiding controversy that he'd forgotten who he actually was beneath all the careful performance. The conversation at the table turned to Sarah's proposal, which had somehow made its way through office gossip channels. "Bit too aggressive for our clients," someone was saying. "Good thing Marcus talked sense into her." Marcus felt something shift inside him as he listened to his colleagues dismiss Sarah's brilliance. These people weren't his friends, he realized. They were fellow prisoners in the same golden cage, all of them so focused on maintaining their positions that they'd forgotten how to actually lead. He excused himself and walked out into the cool evening air. The city streets were alive with energy, filled with people pursuing their own paths without seeking permission or approval from committees. A street musician played saxophone with passionate intensity, not caring if passers-by appreciated his style. A food truck vendor called out enthusiastically about his fusion tacos, confident in his unique vision. These people understood something Marcus had forgotten: authentic influence came from conviction, not consensus. Over the next few weeks, Marcus began to notice patterns everywhere. In meetings, he watched how the most influential people in the room weren't necessarily the ones everyone liked. They were the ones who spoke with quiet certainty, who weren't afraid to disagree respectfully, who brought original thinking rather than echoing popular opinions. He thought about Elena Vasquez, the CEO of a rival firm he'd met at a conference. She'd been polite but direct, unafraid to challenge conventional wisdom. When someone had suggested a conservative investment strategy, Elena had calmly explained why she disagreed, backing her position with clear reasoning. Some people in the audience had seemed uncomfortable with her directness, but Marcus had noticed how everyone leaned forward when she spoke. Her influence was magnetic precisely because it wasn't calculated to please. The breaking point came during a client presentation 3 weeks later. Marcus stood before the board of Meridian Industries, presenting the same safe, predictable strategy he'd perfected over the years. But, as he spoke, he could see the polite boredom in their eyes. They were going through the motions just as much as he was. Halfway through his presentation, Marcus made a decision that surprised even himself. He stopped mid-sentence, closed his laptop, and looked directly at the client. "I need to be honest with you," he said, feeling his heart race. "What I've been presenting isn't what I actually think you need. It's what I thought you wanted to hear." The room fell silent. Marcus could feel his career hanging in the balance, but, for the first time in years, he felt completely awake. He began to speak from his authentic understanding of their business, sharing insights he'd kept buried beneath layers of diplomatic language. He talked about risks they were avoiding that they should be taking, and comfortable strategies that were actually more dangerous than they appeared. When he finished, the silence stretched for what felt like an eternity. Then, the CEO of Meridian Industries leaned forward with genuine interest. "Now that," she said, "is what we've been waiting to hear. When can we start implementing these recommendations?" As Marcus walked back to his office that afternoon, he felt something he hadn't experienced in years: the exhilarating fear and freedom of being truly himself in a professional setting. He'd broken the first chain that had bound him, the desperate need for universal approval. And, already, he could sense that his influence was beginning to transform from something borrowed to something authentically his own. The real test would come in how he handled the consequences of this new authenticity. Some people wouldn't appreciate his directness. His carefully maintained image as the agreeable team player would begin to crack. But Marcus was starting to understand what Machiavelli had known centuries ago: real influence required the courage to be disliked by some in order to be truly respected by those who mattered. 6 months after Marcus Rivera had shocked himself by speaking honestly to the Meridian Industries board, his professional life had transformed in ways he hadn't expected. The client had not only implemented his unconventional recommendations but had also referred 3 other companies to Sterling and Associates, specifically requesting Marcus's direct involvement. His quarterly numbers were stronger than ever, yet he felt more unsettled than before. The success should have felt like validation, but Marcus was beginning to recognize another chain that bound him: his attachment to outcomes. He'd traded his need for approval for an equally dangerous dependency on results. Every victory made him hungrier for the next one. Every setback sent him into spirals of strategic recalculation. He was like a gambler on a winning streak, unable to step away from the table even when he knew the house always won eventually. The realization crystallized during a late-night conversation with his brother Diego. They sat in Diego's workshop, surrounded by the smell of wood shavings and the half-finished frame of a custom dining table. Diego's hands moved with unconscious precision as he sanded the smooth curves of a table leg. "You seem stressed for someone who's killing it at work," Diego observed, not looking up from his work. Mom called yesterday. Said you got another promotion. Marcus watched his brother's steady, meditative movements. Senior vice president, he confirmed. Track to partner by next year if things keep going well. If things keep going well, Diego repeated, finally, looking up. You hear yourself, right? You're already planning for your success to disappear. The observation hit Marcus harder than he'd expected. When had he started thinking about success as something temporary, something that could be lost if he didn't maintain perfect control? He thought about the past months, how each victory had felt hollow because he was already worried about the next quarter's numbers. I built this table 3 weeks ago, Diego continued, running his hand along the smooth surface. Client loved it. But I'm not spending tonight worried about whether next month's client will be equally satisfied. This table is done. It's good. Tomorrow I'll start fresh on something new. Marcus envied his brother's ability to complete something and release it. In finance, nothing was ever truly finished. Every success created new expectations, new pressures to perform at an even higher level. He'd become addicted to the cycle of achievement and anxiety, unable to simply appreciate what he'd accomplished. The attachment problem revealed itself more clearly the following week when Marcus met Rebecca Martinez, a freelance consultant who'd been brought in to advise on the Meridian project. Rebecca worked differently than anyone Marcus had encountered in corporate America. She approached each client interaction with intense focus but seemed completely detached from whether they implemented her recommendations. During their first strategy session, Marcus watched her present ideas that were even bolder than his own honest assessment had been. When one executive pushed back aggressively, questioning her experience and credentials, Rebecca responded with calm professionalism but zero defensiveness. That's a fair concern, she said simply. Here's my reasoning, and here's the data that supports it. If you decide to go in a different direction, that's absolutely your choice. My job is to give you my best thinking, not to convince you to like it. After the meeting, Marcus found himself walking with Rebecca toward the elevator. Doesn't it bother you when clients resist your ideas? He asked. Rebecca smiled. Why would it bother me? I'm not attached to being right. I'm attached to being useful. Sometimes being useful means having clients reject my advice and learn from their own experiments. I get paid the same either way. Marcus realized he'd never worked with anyone so competent who seemed so unconcerned with proving their competence. Rebecca's detachment from outcomes made her paradoxically more influential. Clients trusted her precisely because she didn't seem to need their validation. Over the following weeks, Marcus began to experiment with this mindset. Instead of staying late to triple-check presentations, he focused on delivering his best thinking and releasing his attachment to how it was received. When a potential client chose a competitor's proposal over his, Marcus felt the familiar sting of rejection but noticed something new underneath it, curiosity about what he could learn from the experience rather than desperate strategizing about how to win them back. The shift wasn't easy. Years of conditioning had trained him to see every outcome as a reflection of his worth. But, gradually, Marcus began to understand what Machiavelli had observed about the relationship between power and desire. The more desperately someone wanted something, the weaker their position became. Attachment to specific outcomes made leaders reactive, defensive, and ultimately less effective. The biggest test came when Jonathan Sterling called Marcus into his office for what seemed like a routine check-in. Sterling's expression was more serious than usual as he gestured for Marcus to sit. We need to talk about the Patterson account, Sterling began. Patterson Industries was Marcus's largest client, representing nearly 20% of his annual revenue. They're considering making some changes to their investment strategy. Apparently, they've been approached by Elena Vasquez's firm with some aggressive proposals. Marcus felt his stomach drop. Elena Vasquez, the CEO he'd admired for her authentic directness, was now threatening to steal his biggest client. The old Marcus would have immediately begun planning counterattacks, preparing desperate presentations, doing whatever it took to keep Patterson locked in. But something different happened. Marcus felt the fear, acknowledged it, and then watched it pass through him without taking control. What kind of changes are they considering? He asked, genuinely curious rather than defensive. Sterling seemed surprised by Marcus's calm response. Honestly, some of their ideas sound pretty smart. More aggressive than our usual approach, but potentially more rewarding. I was expecting you to be more concerned. I am concerned, Marcus replied. But if Elena's proposals are better for Patterson's long-term goals, then maybe we should learn from them instead of just trying to compete. The conversation continued for 20 minutes, but Marcus noticed how his lack of attachment to keeping Patterson at all costs actually made him more strategic, not less. He asked better questions, offered more creative solutions, and found himself thinking about what would genuinely serve the client rather than just protecting his own position. 2 weeks later, Marcus received an unexpected call from Patterson's CFO. We want to propose something unusual, she said. Instead of switching firms, we'd like to work with both you and Elena's team on different aspects of our portfolio. Your honest assessment convinced us that collaboration might serve us better than competition. The arrangement was unconventional, but it worked brilliantly. Marcus found himself learning from Elena's aggressive strategies while teaching her team about risk management and client relationship building. His influence grew not because he'd fought to maintain control, but because he'd released his desperate grip on a specific outcome. Months later, Marcus reflected on how different this felt from his earlier success with Meridian. That victory had felt fragile, something he needed to protect and repeat. This collaboration with Elena felt sustainable, built on authentic value rather than careful positioning. He thought about Rebecca's comment about being useful rather than being right. The distinction was crucial. When Marcus had been attached to being right, every disagreement felt like a threat to his identity. Now that he focused on being useful, disagreements became opportunities to understand different perspectives and find better solutions. The transformation wasn't just professional. Marcus's relationship with his parents shifted as he became less reactive to their expectations. When his mother asked about his timeline for making partner, he found himself responding honestly rather than managing her emotions. It'll happen when it happens, Mom. Right now I'm focused on doing work I'm proud of. His social life changed too. The colleagues who'd been drawn to his agreeable nature drifted away, but he found himself connecting more deeply with people who appreciated his authenticity. Conversations became more interesting when he wasn't constantly calculating how to maintain everyone's approval. Marcus was beginning to understand that attachment and influence were inversely related. The less he clung to specific outcomes, the more creative and strategic he became. The less he needed things to go a particular way, the more often they went better than he'd imagined. But there was still one more chain to break, and it was perhaps the most subtle and dangerous of all. Marcus was becoming attached to his new identity as someone who wasn't attached to outcomes. He was proud of his transformation, and pride, he was learning, could be just another form of prison. 2 years after Marcus Rivera first challenged his need for approval, he faced a crisis that would test everything he'd learned about authentic influence. Sterling and Associates was being acquired by a massive international firm, and the merger meant that half the senior staff would be redundant. Despite his recent successes, Marcus's position was far from secure. The news arrived on a Thursday morning during what should have been a routine partners meeting. Jonathan Sterling's voice was steady as he delivered the information, but Marcus could see the exhaustion in his mentor's eyes. Global Vest has made an offer we can't refuse, Sterling explained. But they're bringing their own senior team. We have 90 days to prove which positions they should keep. Around the conference table, Marcus watched his colleagues' faces transform. The careful politeness that usually characterized these meetings evaporated, replaced by barely concealed panic. Within hours, the office had become a battlefield of aggressive networking, desperate alliance building, and subtle sabotage as everyone fought to secure their survival. Marcus felt the familiar gravitational pull of that energy. The old version of himself would have immediately begun strategizing, identifying which executives to charm, which colleagues to outmaneuver, which clients to leverage as evidence of his indispensability. But, as he sat in his office that afternoon, watching the sunset paint the city in shades of amber and gold, Marcus realized something unexpected: he wasn't afraid. The absence of fear surprised him more than its presence would have. He'd spent so many years believing that security came from careful positioning and strategic relationships that he'd forgotten what it felt like to simply trust his ability to create value wherever he found himself. But the past 2 years had taught him something crucial: influence wasn't a resource you accumulated, it was a quality you embodied. Rebecca Martinez called him that evening, having heard about the merger through industry networks. "How are you handling the uncertainty?" she asked. "I keep waiting to feel panicked," Marcus admitted. "But mostly I'm curious about what comes next." "That's the difference between having influence and needing to have influence," Rebecca observed. "When you know you can create value anywhere, specific outcomes become much less important." Her words crystallized something Marcus had been sensing but hadn't articulated. The past 2 years hadn't just taught him to be less attached to approval and specific results. They'd revealed that his influence wasn't dependent on his position at Sterling and Associates at all. It was something he carried within himself, something that would transfer to whatever situation he found himself in. This realization was put to the test the following week when Global Vest sent their transition team to evaluate current operations. Marcus found himself presenting to executives who had no relationship with his track record, no knowledge of his recent transformation, and no particular reason to care about preserving his role. Elena Vasquez was part of the evaluation team, having been recruited by Global Vest 6 months earlier. Marcus hadn't seen her since their successful collaboration on the Patterson account, and he was struck by how comfortable he felt in her presence despite the circumstances. There was no awkwardness, no sense of competing for limited resources, just two professionals who respected each other's capabilities. "Tell me about your approach to client relationships," Elena said during his formal interview. It was the kind of question that would have sent the old Marcus into a carefully rehearsed performance about relationship management and client satisfaction metrics. Instead, Marcus found himself speaking honestly about what he'd learned. "I used to think client relationships were about making people happy and giving them what they wanted to hear," he said. "Now I understand that real relationships are built on trust, and trust comes from being willing to tell clients what they need to hear, even when it's uncomfortable." Elena leaned forward, genuinely interested. "Can you give me a specific example?" Marcus told her about a recent interaction with a family office that had wanted to pursue a cryptocurrency investment strategy he believed was too risky for their situation. The old Marcus would have found diplomatic ways to accommodate their preferences while protecting himself from blame if things went wrong. "I told them directly that I thought the strategy was inappropriate for their goals and risk tolerance," Marcus continued. "I explained my reasoning clearly and offered alternative approaches that might give them similar upside with more appropriate downside protection. They weren't thrilled with my pushback initially." "What happened?" "They took time to consider my perspective, consulted with other advisors, and eventually decided I was right. But, more importantly, they told me later that my willingness to disagree with them was the reason they trusted my judgment. They said most advisors just told them what they wanted to hear." Elena nodded thoughtfully. "And if they had chosen to ignore your advice and pursue the original strategy anyway?" "Then, I would have supported their decision professionally while maintaining clear documentation about my recommendations. My job is to provide my best thinking, not to control their choices." As the interview continued, Marcus realized something profound was happening. He wasn't performing for Elena or trying to convince her to save his job. He was simply explaining how he approached his work, sharing his authentic perspective without attachment to how she received it. And, paradoxically, this made the conversation more engaging for both of them. The evaluation process extended over several weeks, during which Marcus watched his colleagues employ increasingly desperate strategies to secure their positions. Some tried to undermine each other's relationships with key clients. Others worked frantically to generate impressive short-term results. A few attempted to curry favor with the Global Vest team through elaborate networking efforts. Marcus continued working as he always had, focused on serving his clients effectively without regard for how it might influence his evaluation. When Global Vest's team asked for his input on various strategic questions, he gave honest assessments based on his experience. When they asked about his colleagues' capabilities, he spoke truthfully about both strengths and weaknesses without trying to elevate himself by diminishing others. 3 weeks before the final decisions were announced, Marcus had lunch with Diego, who was completing a commission piece for a high-end restaurant downtown. They met at a small cafe near Diego's workshop, where the smell of fresh bread mixed with the sound of construction from a nearby building renovation. "You seem different," Diego observed as he studied his brother's face. "Calmer. Like you're not carrying something heavy anymore." Marcus considered the observation. "I think I finally understand what you meant about finishing a table and moving on to the next one. I used to think my career was this continuous thing I had to protect and build. Now I see it more like a series of individual projects, each one complete in itself. Even if you lose your job? Especially if I lose my job. The work I've done stands on its own merit. The relationships I've built are real regardless of where I'm employed. The skills I've developed transfer anywhere. Losing this particular position wouldn't diminish any of that." Diego smiled. "You sound like someone who's finally figured out that his worth isn't tied to his job title." The comment struck Marcus as profoundly accurate. Somewhere in the process of releasing his attachment to approval, outcomes, and results, he discovered something unexpected, a sense of his own value that existed independently of external validation. This wasn't arrogance or pride, it was simply quiet confidence in his ability to create value in any context. When the final decisions were announced, Marcus learned that he would be offered a position with the merged entity, but not the senior role he currently held. Elena had been named to head the new division, and Marcus would report to her as a director rather than senior vice president. Several of his colleagues, including people with longer tenure and impressive track records, were being let go entirely. The old Marcus would have felt the demotion as a humiliating blow to his identity. But, as he sat in the conference room receiving this news, Marcus found himself genuinely pleased for Elena's promotion and curious about what he might learn working more closely with her. The title change felt irrelevant compared to the opportunity to continue doing work he found meaningful. After the meeting, Elena approached him privately. "I want you to know that recommending you for the director role was an easy decision," she said. "Your evaluation interviews were unlike anything I've experienced. You weren't selling yourself or trying to impress anyone. You were just real. That's exactly what we need on this team." "Thank you," Marcus replied. "I'm looking forward to working together. Can I ask you something? Weren't you concerned about the demotion? Most people in your position would have been lobbying hard for a lateral transfer at minimum." Marcus considered the question carefully. "A year ago, I would have been devastated. But I've learned that influence has very little to do with title and everything to do with value creation. I'd rather be a director who's trusted and effective than a senior VP who's constantly worried about protecting his position." Elena's expression shifted to one of genuine respect. "That's exactly the kind of thinking that made me want you on the team." In the months that followed, Marcus discovered that his reduced attachment to title and status had paradoxically increased his influence within the organization. Without the burden of protecting his position, he was free to focus entirely on generating results and supporting his colleagues' success. His ideas carried weight because they weren't wrapped in political considerations or self-serving motivations. 6 months after the merger, Elena promoted him to senior director, a new position that gave him more responsibility and autonomy than his previous role had offered. But Marcus barely noticed the title change. He was too engaged in the actual work to care much about what it was called. Looking back on his transformation, Marcus realized that Machiavelli's insights about power and influence had been profound but incomplete. The Italian philosopher had understood that desperation weakened leaders, that attachment to outcomes created vulnerability, and that the appearance of needing something diminished one's ability to obtain it. But Marcus had discovered something beyond what Machiavelli had written about. When he'd finally released his attachment to results entirely, not just specific outcomes, he'd found a kind of freedom that made influence effortless. He no longer needed to convince anyone of anything because he'd stopped needing to convince himself. He simply did excellent work, spoke honestly, and trusted that value would be recognized and rewarded in ways that served everyone involved. The chains of approval, attachment, and results hadn't just been restraints on his influence. They'd been barriers to experiencing the deep satisfaction that came from work aligned with authentic purpose. Now, sitting in his new office watching the same city that had once seemed like a chessboard, Marcus felt something he'd never experienced before, the quiet confidence that came from knowing his influence was unshakable because it no longer depended on anything outside himself.